Hey everyone, welcome back to Reason and Theology. We're talking about the Islamic dilemma today, joined by returning guest Dr. Khalil Andani, also Louis Dizon and Dr. Stephen Nemes. Dr. Nemesh, I think this is your first time on the show, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Welcome. Yeah, welcome to the show. Louis,
Thank
good
you
to
for
have you
having me.
back on.
Yep, it's great to be on once again.
And Dr. Andani, great to have you on again. Always an honor.
Yeah, I love coming on and just chilling here with you guys. So
I find it to be very productive. And so, what we're going to be doing today is going over kind of reviewing the debate or debate discussion that you just had on capturing Christianity with Sam Shamoon. I thought it was a really interesting conversation, and I wanted to get all of your perspectives on it. So, of course, Dr. Nimesh is going to be coming from Unitarian Christian perspective. Dr. Andani is coming from Ismaili Muslim perspective, and Louis Dizon from a Catholic Christian perspective. So, we're going to get all kinds of views here. Dr. Andani, let's maybe start with you with your overall impression and general comments on that discussion.
yeah, so I mean, I didn't really know what to expect because in preparation, I saw a lot of Sam Shamoon videos, and I mean, he can be quite combative in his discussions, and there was a bit of a misunderstanding about the format. So we'd agreed to opening statements each, right? So I had my opening, and he was supposed to have an opening, and I thought he was gonna give his opening first because the Islamic dilemma is his argument, or at least he's one of the major proponents of it. But then it was decided that he would not have an opening. So then I had to actually present the dilemma, and respond to it. So that was a bit interesting. But overall, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to go on a Christian space, right, and present what I think were viable or what are viable solutions to the dilemma with an uninterrupted 20 minutes. I thought that was really important to do. And then, we got into the discussion. I thought the discussion itself, it was enjoyable for me. Like I have fun in this sort of crossfire format. It's not fun for a lot of people though. But I enjoyed it. It was entertaining and eventful for me. I did think that Sam directed the discussion at times to points or to issues that were not going to be helpful in advancing his argument one way or another. So, for example, at one point, he'll quote a bunch of Salaf who affirm the Torah. Well, that's great, but like that's not enough, to run the Islamic dilemma. You have to show that they affirm the New Testament, and it'll come up today. I'm not aware of actually any pre-modern Muslim exegete who affirmed the entire New Testament as revealed. I'm let alone the Salaf. I don't even think that exists, right? The most you'll get a minority of exegetes affirming the Gospels, like the four Gospels, right? But I'm not aware of any pre-modern person who even affirmed the New Testament. So I wasn't sure why he kept sort of selecting certain authorities, or not even authorities, just selecting examples on that. So and I think the other issue which will come up is like there's a broader issue of when we read a text, right? Should we presume a high likelihood of a contradiction within a text when there are other readings that are not leading to contradictions? I think that's one of the big issues. Sort of what are our what's the prior probability of an author, outright contradicting themselves in something like the Quran or the Bible or whatever. So yeah, but overall, I was happy. I will say that there's a lot of post debate commentary from sort of Sam Shamoon supporting Christians who are, now the way that things work now is we have debates and then you have the post debate narrative, right? Narrativizing. And there's a lot of one-sided narrativizing. It doesn't bother me that much. I think it's a way for people to know more about who I am and the work that I do. So I'm thankful for the exposure, but obviously I don't agree with a lot of the narrativizing that's been going on in the last couple of days. But yeah, so I thought it would be nice to come here. I know Lewis has his own thoughts on the Islamic dilemma. I know you shared them on Facebook. We could chat about that. I asked Stephen to come on because I find he's sort of in a unique position on this, where he does have an adherence to the Bible, right, as scripture, but he has different theological views than you guys. And I think it provides a neutral perspective on this overall debate. If we hear from his thoughts, and he's also trained in philosophy as well, and he can assess arguments. So yeah.
Okay, and before we dive into specifics, let's just back it up and give a quick definition to what the Islamic dilemma is and the three solutions, potential solutions that you provided in that discussion, and the one that you prefer the most.
Sure. Now, what we have the option of either playing it on the video, or I can actually just put those same slides up if you want.
Yeah, that's fine. If you want to pull the slides
Sure.
up, yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead,
I'll
share
just
your
put them up.
screen.
It'll save us some time. We don't have
Yeah,
to
maybe
play
just
that.
like a 5 minute
Sure.
overview.
All right. So we'll just do the screen share here.
Okay.
All right. So I stated the dilemma like this because the original topic that I was supposed to talk to Sam about, as decided by Cameron, was like, what is the Quran's view on the gospel or the Christian scriptures? But the gospel was supposed to be the focus. So I've stated the Islamic dilemma this way. Premise one: the Quran confirms the divine inspiration, authority, and preservation of the New Testament. Now, you could substitute New Testament and with like the Christian Bible as a whole, if you want to. Like, you can include Old Testament or not, but the whole dilemma hinges on the New Testament being confirmed. Okay, so the Quran confirms the New Testament as true. That's premise one. Premise two: the Quran contradicts certain teachings in the New Testament, especially as small o Orthodox Christians understand the New Testament. So premise three then is, and you'll notice here, this argument is an appeal to people with Muslim beliefs. Like, if you don't even believe the Quran is true, this argument doesn't really get you much, right? It's effective because it works on a Muslim who already holds the Quran to be authoritative. So premise three: if the Quran is true, the New Testament must be true. But because there's a contradiction now, the Quran is contradicting itself. It's affirming a text or a group of texts and yet denying the content of that group of texts. The conclusion then is the Quran must be false because it contradicts itself. So that's the dilemma. Now, let's be clear. There is no peer-reviewed journal article that actually states the dilemma. So there's no like official version of this, right? So if you watch different debates, so like, this is something like what you'll see on like David Wood's channel, for example. Sam has put it this way in his video. So that's where I picked it up from. But there's no like textbook where I can like quote and say, oh, this is the proper rendition of it.
And you provided three potential solutions for these, right?
I did. So the first solution, and this is what was my preferred solution. So first solution is, we deny premise one. We do not believe that the Quran actually affirms the New Testament, right, as true or as a scripture from God. What the Quran does affirm, and I gave positive evidence for this, is the Quran affirms or confirms something called the gospel, which is a divine revelation God gives to Jesus, and then Jesus is the one who teaches that to the children of Israel. So that's a gospel in the singular. What is the relationship between the gospel that the Quran attests to and what Christians have? And because the gospel is the teaching of Jesus, right? And again, remember, the Quran opposes certain claims like Jesus being God or Jesus being the Son of God. So the Quran doesn't regard the Trinity or divine sonship as the actual gospel of Jesus, right? The Quranic Jesus doesn't preach those things. So the Quranic gospel of Jesus has a particular content. It basically matches Quranic monotheism. So where is that gospel? Because the Christians always ask us, well, where is it? Well, it's not a book, and the Quran never says that the gospel of Jesus is a book, a physical book with like on paper. It just never says that. It describes the content of this gospel. It never describes its physical form. So if you ask me today, oh, where is the Injil? And, you know, there's a really funny video on Speaker's Corner, Hyde Park, where a bunch of Christians start chanting, where is the Injil? As if like they're making a point. The Injil is the teaching of Jesus, and you can find some of that Injil embedded within the four Gospels. And that's not an outrageous statement. People who study the historical Jesus will say that within the four Gospels, we have sayings of Jesus, which most probably or in high probability go back to Jesus. That would be the gospel that the Quran is confirming and talking about. So this position, as far as I know, based on like my understanding of the literature, this is like the historical majority of Muslims. Was it always a majority of Muslims? I don't know. We have to just go by the data. But I would say by 1500, this was the majority position of Muslims. And I would say definitely by today, it's the historical majority position, right? That the four Gospels in the New Testament is not confirmed by the Quran. These contain the message of Jesus, and they also contain false teachings. So this is the view that I was defending. And frankly, if you accept my defense, which maybe you guys don't, but if you did, then there's no dilemma. And this would be the majority defense of the dilemma. Now, the next thing is, okay, let's say, and again, here's how it plays out, right? So does the Quran confirm the New Testament? No. And again, I maintain there's A, lack of evidence. There's nowhere in the Quran it confirms the New Testament. And B, what the Quran does confirm, what it does affirm, is the gospel of Jesus, which is never defined as the New Testament or even the four Gospels. So premise 1 is false. Premise 2 is true. Premise 3 is false. Premise 4 doesn't really matter now once you've negated premise 1, like it's irrelevant, and therefore the dilemma doesn't hold. So this is what I was defending. But, there's another way that you can approach this argument, which is to say the Quran affirms that the gospel of Jesus is generally preserved within the four gospel canon. Not the whole New Testament, but the four gospel canon. So this position, as far as I can tell, existed among Muslims. The most famous proponent was al-Biqai, but there's probably some more people who held this, but Biqai is the most vocal proponent of this view. And Biqai did quote the four gospels. He used the four gospels as commentary to interpret the Quran, right? So that's the view. And modern people today who've used this, Ali Atai, I don't know if you guys know who Ali Atai is. I would consider Ali Atai among the best biblically informed Muslim scholars today, and if you ever have an opportunity, I mean, you should have him on the channel. So, he's a Muslim, he's a Sunni Muslim scholar. He's well-versed in Sufism, and I think he knows the Bible very well. He knows the biblical languages, right? Like, I believe he knows Greek, he knows Hebrew. So he did a dissertation, which is very interesting to read, even if you don't agree with it. In his dissertation, he does this whole exercise where he says, let us assume that the Gospel of John is the Injil or contains the Injil. And he goes through and he shows that a Muslim who is in the Sunni Sufi tradition of Ibn Arabi can easily affirm the content of the Gospel of John and interpret the Christological claims within the Gospel of John in line with the Sunni Sufi theological worldview. So that's in his dissertation. Another author that I know, Reza Shah Kazemi, he's written several articles on this topic where he engages with the Christian Gospels in a constructive way. He affirms the content and he shows that the Christological claims within the Gospels can be interpreted in line with sort of Sufi Muslim understandings. So I'm aware of this position and I'm quite sympathetic to it. Like, as a thought experiment, I would be perfectly comfortable exegeting the four gospels in line with my esoteric Shi'i Muslim thought and metaphysics, and I wouldn't have an issue. So if you put me on the hot seat and said, hey, let's read the gospels together, I would quite probably enjoy it. And then the third, and again, this is how this thing works out here. So premise one is affirmed, but only for the four gospels. But then that you would say that, no, the Quran doesn't really contradict the teachings of the four gospels when it's interpreted. Therefore, you can affirm the four gospels are true if the Quran is true. And then, of course, the same person would say, I don't think the four gospels teach the Trinity, the divinity of Christ. Personally, if you ask me outside of this dilemma, just as a person, I personally am not convinced that the four gospels actually teach the Trinity or the divinity of Jesus as Christians understand it, and so on. I'm not convinced of that. That's why I would be comfortable defending this position. And of course, then here the Quran is false doesn't follow because there's a clear resolution. And then finally, the third one, and I don't know many people who go by the third response, but I was able to find at least one person. So the third response to say, yes, the Quran affirms the New Testament, basically all of it, and then you would read the New Testament as a sort of, non-Trinitarian text, right? Where Jesus is the human representative of God. You would read the atonement theory in the New Testament as more of a redemptive atonement as opposed to a vicarious atonement. So this view also exists, and it sort of harmonizes the Quran and the New Testament as a whole. And I'll say this much. I wrote extreme minority of Muslims over here. To be brutally honest with you, I could, based on my knowledge today, and that could change tomorrow, but based on my knowledge today, I could probably count on one hand how many Muslims actually believe in the whole New Testament as divine revelation. I just don't think there are many. I know Sayyid Ahmed Khan, 19th century Muslim modernist, he believed the New Testament was revelation and the Old Testament. He wrote a whole commentary, and in preparation for the debate, I just read about his work. I haven't actually read his commentary. So that's where it is. Now, we don't need to go through the rest of my slides unless people have specific questions, but this was like the overview. And I was basically in this debate, I wanted to take, although I'm a Muslim, but I wanted to take what you would call an academic theological perspective, right? So I am doing theology, but I didn't want to be doing such a very exclusivist theology, right? I prefer a more sort of pluralistic approach to theology, which acknowledges that within one religious tradition, you can have different theological interpretations, and different interpretations can lead to different outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Different theological approaches.
I think we lost you for half a second there. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So I was just saying that the approach that I was trying to take in this debate or dialogue was one of academic theology, right? Where you're doing theology, but you try not to do it from like this narrow sectarian lens. You try to do theology from a more broader lens, and you recognize that in theology, there are different points of view, right? And you want to give people options of theology that they could take, because I can't speak for all Muslims if I just choose option one. Or if I choose, like if I did option two, like hypothetically, if I argued option two, there would be a backlash. All these Muslims would come out and they'd be like, oh, well, like we don't believe in option two, and this sort of thing. So I wanted to acknowledge like this sort of big tent of perspectives.
Now, I have a quick question about premise one, and then I want to get out of the way so Dr. Nemes and Lewis can jump in here. But let me just quickly share my screen to ask the question about premise one. So y'all had a discussion about this this part from the Quran 566. Sam was pointing out that here there's an affirmation of the Torah, the gospel, and what has been revealed to them from their Lord. Now, I think you mentioned there's several options here. Number one, this other third category could just be referring back to these things, or it could be referring to revelation from the Quran, or it could be referring to something like the book of Isaiah or Daniel. Now, my question is, okay, I could see those as options, but could this kind of be what Sam's position was, that it is an affirmation of the entire New Testament. Is that possible? I know that might not be your reading, but is it possible?
So, I mean, logically speaking, it's possible, right? Like just reading the text by itself. But the thing is, if you don't really have a prior commitment to the New Testament in any way, why would you think that refers to the New Testament? The other thing is, remember the description of it. It says that which has been revealed. So if the New Testament, if you want the New Testament to be a candidate for that which has been sent down from your Lord, then one would have to sort of show some sort of evidence to the Muslim that the New Testament epistles are actual revelation. Right? One can't assert it. You'd have to show, okay, from a Quranic perspective, does it consider the New Testament writings and epistles as revelation? Does it consider Paul and I don't know, some of these other writers, does it consider them to be prophets that God gave revelation to?
And I think his response was, well, the audience to whom it was written, they by this time already had a fleshed out canon that included the 27 book New Testament canon. What would you say in response to that?
No, they had a canon. I think obviously you have a 27 book canon. That's not in dispute. But why would, where is the positive evidence that the Quran affirms this 27 book canon? I just don't see it. What I see in the Quran is a series of statements that oppose the contents of this 27 book canon. At least remember, because that same Christian who has a 27 book canon in Arabia, they believe that canon teaches the Trinity, the sonship of Christ, substitutionary atonement, or some sort of vicarious atonement. That's how they interface with the canon, right? Through those main beliefs, which they enact in liturgy. So the Quran comes out very clearly in Surah 5, and it denies the Trinity. It denies the divinity of Christ. It even denies the Eucharist, because, in Surah 5, the Quran recasts the Eucharist as an entirely different ritual, not as the body and blood of Christ. Now, I didn't get to this in the debate, but take what Paul says about the Eucharistic rite, and take some of, if you read some of the Last Supper narratives in some of the Gospels, right? So the Quran has a Last Supper narrative which completely goes against that you find in the New Testament. So to me, because the Quran is opposing the teachings of that book, of that text, I don't see what the positive case is that it is a New Testament. And the last thing I would add is, I don't believe we have any pre-modern Muslim who ever read that verse, what has been sent down to you from your Lord, and said, "Oh yeah, that's the New Testament." I don't think anybody ever reached this conclusion.
Yeah, Dr. Nemes, you had a follow-up there?
Would you be willing to put up the verse once more from the Quran?
Absolutely. Let me pull it right back up here. You should be able to see it now.
Okay, so had they observed the Torah, the Gospel, and what had been revealed to them from their Lord, they would have been overwhelmed. I wonder, in the Arabic, are the verbs in the third person or are they in the second person? Because it seems to me there's a difference between talking about the Christians and talking to the Christians. And if you make that distinction, then there seems to me to be an easy response to this argument. If this text is talking about the Christians and not to them, then that allows for the Quranic author to understand the terms in the sense that he intends them, and not in the sense that Christians would have used them. So that you can make a distinction between the way Christians think about these terms and the way the Quranic author uses these terms. And that distinction especially comes to the fore if he's talking about them and not to them. So that's why I ask about the person of the verb.
Yeah, so maybe I can speak to that really quickly. So in the Arabic, it says, وَلَوْ أَنَّهُمْ أَقَامُوا وَالتَّوْرَاةَ وَالْإِنْجِيلَ وَمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْهِمْ مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ. So it's third person, plural verbs all throughout. And the context, the surrounding context of Surah Al-Ma'idah does point to the antecedent of the pronoun being the Christians. So the Christians are those who are in view in this passage.
So what I would say here is that from the fact that the Christians are in view in this passage, it does not follow that the terms are being used in senses that Christians would find intelligible. The Quranic author is speaking about Christians, but he's not speaking to them. And it's within his right to use words that he finds intelligible. He doesn't have to use them in the same sense that Christians mean. So this point about, how would Christians have understood this direction seems to me to be a red herring here, because it's not a discourse addressed to Christians, so that their interpretation of the text is almost a red herring for its interpretation. What matters is what could the Quranic author plausibly understand by these terms? And it seems to me that in responding to this question, Khalil has an argument, given the way that the Quran treats documents given the way that the Quran treats doctrines which Christians thought were found in the New Testament in other places, it makes sense to think that the Injil here does not refer to the New Testament, or even to the fourfold Gospels, but it refers to what the Quranic author understands by the Injil, which is presumably the revelation of Allah to Jesus.
Yeah.
That seems to me to be an obvious point.
But doesn't it elsewhere then refer them to what they actually have in their possession, and tells them to go
talking
and
about a particular verse? Are you talking about the judge verse, judged by the Injil?
Right.
Yeah. So let's go to that. Right.
I do have something to say about this argument also. So I don't want to cut anyone off, and I am like the least qualified person to be having this discussion out of everybody here. But there were things that did occur to me as I was listening to the debate. So if I would, when the time is right, I would like to say something about that argument as well also.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Andani, are you pulling it up there on your end?
Yeah. So you want me to do it, or you want to do it?
It's Surah 2, which
so you can start it at 543 if you want.
543.
Start at 543. Surah 5 / verse 43.
Okay. Share my screen. Here we go.
Yeah. So this is a part. So first, a general overview, right? A lot of Surah 5 is concerned with laws for the community of Muhammad, and laws for the Jews and Christians. So it appears that in 7th century Medina, Muhammad was the political and religious leader, right? And those who followed Muhammad religiously, right, who took him as a spiritual leader, they are called believers, later called Muslims. Then you also had Jews and Christians who are living in the area, like they are under the political leadership of Muhammad, and these people would come to Prophet Muhammad to obtain legal arbitration, like legal judgments, right? So legal judgments cover things like, okay, if somebody commits manslaughter, like what's the penalty, right? Because they don't have a criminal justice system, right? So who's in charge of that? The Prophet is in charge of that. Someone commits adultery, someone commits murder, someone commits treason. So you have Jews and Christians who are approaching Muhammad and asking him for a ruling for their community, basically. And some of the surrounding verses suggest that certain people, especially Jews, would come to him and they wouldn't like the ruling that he gives. Like they would try to get a different ruling, or they would follow a different ruling, this sort of thing. So it starts here where it says, well, why are they coming to you, Muhammad, right? First part, like why are they coming to you for judgment when they have the Torah containing, or in which is the judgment, the hukum of Allah? So this is talking about the law of Moses, basically. And it's telling them you should be doing legal judgments by your laws, by your legal tradition. So it's not even concerned. These verses are not about, they're not going to the Prophet for theological judgments, right? They're not asking the Prophet, okay, is God a Trinity or not? That's not what's going on here. They're asking for judgments about like punishments, law of Talion, possibly dietary matters. All right, so now we keep going down, right? So you can just scroll to the next, go to 44. So then we have, it says, you guys have the Torah, the Jews have Torah, and that describes what the Torah is. And here the Torah is being talked about in a legal context, right? So here, I know people like to think that, okay, Torah means the Pentateuch, right? But the term Torah here is used specifically for Mosaic law, right? So we're talking about like those laws that you could find maybe today in Exodus and like Deuteronomy, basically. So this is saying that God gave this Torah. It's the law by which the Israelite prophets judge by, and this sort of thing. All right, so we can keep going. And then it actually refers to one of these Torah laws, right? This is the law of Talion. The Quran quotes the law of Talion. And then, interestingly, and again, this is on the topic of law. It's not on the topic of theology, right? Topic of law. Then it refers to Jesus being sent, confirming the Torah, i.e., confirming the Mosaic law. And as an aside, he actually does that in what's recorded of Jesus in Matthew, for example. Like, he actually does confirm like Mosaic law for the most part. All right, so then it says we gave Jesus the gospel, right? So Jesus brings an additional message called the gospel, and we talked about what that is. And the gospel is the confirmation of the Torah, right? And now we go to verse 47. So again, keep in mind the legal context. So now let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah has sent down in it. What is the it? It is the gospel. It's not the New Testament. It's the gospel. So it's telling Christians as well who are coming to Muhammad for judgment. It's saying you guys should be getting legal judgments from the gospel that was preached by Jesus.
Now, Lewis, I know you have some questions here because you actually had some really good questions that you had posted on your Facebook.
Yeah.
So maybe tie that in here.
Before I get there, I actually do kind of want to interact with Khalil's exegesis of Surah Al-Ma'idah. Could you pull up that passage for me once again, actually? Because I want to highlight something there. So if you go back to Ayah 44.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's the one that says we revealed the Torah containing guidance and light by which the prophets who submitted themselves to Allah made judgments for Jews. So just, just from a cursory reading of it, it seems to me like there is more here than just, it's useful for legal disputes, because it's referring to it in words that are much more elevated than that. It's actually revealed by God, contains guidance and light, and then it ends by saying, "Nor trade my revelations for a fleeting gain." So again, it's being referred to as something that is revealed by God. And related to this is the apparent the occasion of revelation for it. Now, I don't know if Khalil has this in his tradition, but in the Sunni tradition, there's this story that is well known because it's in a lot of different sources like Ibn Ishaq, Bukhari, and Sunan Abu Dawud, about how there were two Jews who were accused of adultery, and they were asking Muhammad for arbitration regarding that, and then they were told to use the Torah to see what is in it. And depending on which specific tradition or which specific version of that tradition you look at, some of them seem to have Muhammad almost regarding the Torah in exalted terms. Like there was one particular narration, for example, where Muhammad is described as placing the Torah on a cushion, and then he says, "I believe in you and in him who revealed you." So I was wondering, how do those data points line up with the exegesis that Dr. Andani presented, that this passage is only referring to the legal use of the Torah.
And maybe to add to that, on that hadith in particular, the one where he puts the Torah on the pillow, I've heard that that's a weak hadith. If you could maybe touch on that.
Actually, funny enough, you can pull it up. Actually, let me pull it up.
Yeah, please do.
Because I do have I was actually looking at it as we speak. This is the one in question. So there's multiple versions of this hadith, but this is the one that has the strongest wording. So this is from Sunan Abi Dawud. It's number 4449. So this has the strongest language, because you'll notice that mentions that he was sitting on a cushion. He places the Torah on the cushion, and then he says there, Amantu biki wa biman anzalaki. I believed in thee and in him who revealed thee. Now, the grading of that, as you can see, is Hasan. Now, this grading is provided by Al-Albani, who is considered one of the forefathers of the Salafi movement. So his judgment on the authenticity of the hadith may not necessarily be shared by non-Salafis, but for what it's worth, this is what we have. And Hasan is sort of like just one level below Sahih. It's not, it's fairly good, but it's not impeccable. It's definitely better than weak.
Yeah, I've seen others go into the isnad and question it and come to the conclusion that it's weak, but then I don't know enough to judge one way or the other. Just throwing it out there to get y'all's perspective on it.
Yeah, I'm not the best. I'm not an expert when it comes to biographical information on transmitters, so that particular issue is above my pay grade.
So here's what's going to happen. So I can answer this just from like what would a Quranic studies scholar say, right? And then like what would a Sunni say? So firstly, in Quranic studies, like we almost never use hadith to interpret the Quran, because there's a time gap between all the hadith literature and the Quran. So like nobody in Quranic studies, and you, Lewis, you obviously you know this, right? Nobody will say, okay, the Torah means this because there's a hadith about putting the Torah on a cushion or whatever. Like nobody will do that. No one in the field will like take this seriously. So from a more academic Quranic studies perspective, this is like it's not a relevant data point at all, because most probably this didn't happen. Now, if what we wanted to do, and this sort of will lead me to the next part, but let's say that academically we're looking at this and we're like, you know what, but where does this hadith come from? Like, does it, like, maybe it doesn't go back to the Prophet, but does this hadith represent a view of some Muslims, like in the first 100 years, 200 years? And what we would do is we would probably try to collect all the different transmissions of this hadith that we could find. Now, I just at a very cursory look from what I know of this hadith, I don't think this is a massively transmitted hadith. It may even be a solitary report. Don't quote me on that, but I can't tell exactly. But just from the look of it, it doesn't seem to be like, it's not. Firstly, it's not Sahih. It's Hasan, which, as you said, Hasan is like a grade below Sahih. But also, a Hasan hadith by itself, like it's not enough to establish the content of the hadith as like firmly true, So from a Sunni perspective, if you wanted to use this hadith, you'd have to find several parallel transmissions of it, and then you'd have to make the argument and say, look, this is such a widely transmitted hadith, like we have to now accept this data point that the Prophet did this, that the Prophet considered the physical Torah. The other issue is we don't know that this, like in the hadith itself, right? What's in the hadith? What is in that book? Is it the Pentateuch? What is it? Is it Deuteronomy?
Yeah.
Is it the 5 books? Like, what is it? The hadith doesn't tell you.
We could infer, because the specific the details kind of give us a clue. It talks about stoning to death for adultery. There is in fact a passage in the Bible that talks about stoning to death for adultery. It's Deuteronomy 22 verse 24. So it's quite probable that if some version of this event happened, that the verse they were reading was that verse.
Right. So now, do we think they're taking like the full Pentateuch though in one like in one thing? It's a bit hard to believe in the 7th century that the whole Pentateuch is going to be in. And I'm trying to look at the description here. They said bring the Torah. So, it's not clear to me. Like, is this the Pentateuch or is it Deuteronomy? Or is it just one? Is it just a few pages of Deuteronomy, right? So even if we took the Hadith on board, it's not enough to tell you what exactly is the prophets affirming. This doesn't seem to be conclusive. But what most Sunnis will say is that this is not a widely transmitted report. And from what I'm aware, if you look at how today's Sunnis have responded to this, so for example, I think Bassam Zawadi, he's like been one of the chief people, and not that I agree with his theological views because I think we're on opposite ends, but just to sort of present what a trad Sunni would say, right? So Bassam Zawadi, if I recall, I think he disputes the authenticity of this hadith. Like, he actually says it's weak because one of the transmitters is seen as weak by earlier hadith authorities. So that's probably what a more traditional Sunni is going to say. The thing about the Sunnah.com ratings, right? So, Albani may grade something as Hassan, but that doesn't mean Ibn Hajar graded it that way. Like Sunni hadith grading is like a buffet. Like, you can go find a different grader. They might grade the same hadith higher, or they may grade it lower. But it's a good question. It's a good question to ask, right? What complicates this is, let's say you bring this hadith, but then we have other hadith, right, where Ibn Abbas, for example, will say, you people of the book, you guys have altered your book. You altered your revelation or your scripture.
I think the answer, I think the answer to that is that both opinions were already extant during the time that the hadith were being compiled. So,
no, you're right, and there is a good book. It's called like Muslim Perspective, I think, by Camilla Adang. Like, you must have read this, Louis.
Yes, Camilla Adang. I actually had her book in the back of my head while I was doing the research on this topic. So she, so for the benefit of the audience, Camilla Adang is a Jewish scholar who specializes in Islamic perceptions of Judaism and the Hebrew Bible. So she wrote a book on Muslim views on the Hebrew Bible, and she looks at 10 early Muslim scholars who interacted with the Hebrew Bible in some capacity. And what she found was that of those 10, the earliest who actually explicitly mentions any kind of textual corruption happening to the Torah was, I believe it was Al-Maqdisi, who lived around the 10th or early 11th century. And then after him, the next one was Ibn Hazm, who really made the most extensive argument for textual corruption up to that point.
The thing is that for the present purpose, though, this entire line... sorry, Stephen, did you have something to say? I thought I saw your hand. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I wanted to raise a couple of questions because I have some thoughts about this issue, but I don't know whether I don't know enough to know whether my thoughts are any good. So I want to raise them here. It seems to me that if there are two things here. First of all, there's the prior question about the authority of the hadith for Islamic theology. And then there is the question about interpreting particular hadith and relating them to historic moments that are recorded in the Quran. Okay, so in the first place, the first question would be, what authority do the hadith have, let's say, for you as an Ismaili Muslim? And that's my first question. My second question would be, the hadith are not the Quran. So even if, let's say, Muhammad had this moment where he placed the Torah on a cushion and he bowed down before it and he said whatever, it still seems to me like there's a certain priority of the Quran, isn't there? Like, from that moment to the writing of Surah 5 or whatever it might have been, time can have passed, different things can have happened. Muhammad could have come to a different understanding of things. One thing that's interesting about the Quran is that it's basically a foundational religious book written entirely within the lifespan of a single person. It's not like the Old and New Testaments, where you have a variety of texts that are written by different persons in different times and places, and a theological vision sort of historically becomes synthesized and coherent only over time, as different points of view are being brought together and later interpreters are bringing them all together. It seems to me, historically speaking, that you would have that exact same process of synthesis and development and progression within a single person's lifetime. So I wonder, like, what actually would this hadith even prove? Let's say that, you know, he places a Torah on a cushion and he bows and he says, I believe I believe in you. Then when he sits down and writes the Quran, does that mean that he is affirming everything blank slate, you know, that's in the Torah? It seems to me like there's just a massive logical invalidity here, that the actual argument is unclear. So here, I suppose those would be my questions. In the first place, what role do the hadith play for Ismaili Muslims, theologically speaking? And in the second place, how is this actually relevant? How is this hadith actually relevant to the interpretation of, like, let's say, Surah 5, or the way that the Quran talks about, you know, the Torah and the Injil and so on?
Okay, so the bunch of things. So for Ismaili Muslims, the Sunni Hadith corpus doesn't hold any water for us. Okay, so for me, theologically, I would just be like, I don't care about this Hadith. I don't even have to grade it. It's like, it's not this Hadith collection, right? This Hadith, this is in Abu Dawood, right? Sunan Abu Dawood. So this is a Sunni Hadith book. So for Shia Muslims, they would just be like, pass, right?
Okay.
For
just
Sunni,
to be clear, so
Yeah.
from your point of view, okay, so this is like somebody offering an argument against Christianity, and then you have Eastern Orthodox theologians who would give their answer, and Roman Catholic theologians who would give their answer, and Lutherans might give their answer, and Calvinists might give their answer, and Pentecostals or Unitarians might give. So you have different schools who respond differently, right?
Yeah.
So what will work as an argument against one school will not necessarily work as an argument against another. So
Yeah.
this is why I don't understand why such a big deal is being made out of this, because a problem for Sunni Muslims is not a problem for all Muslims. So why does this matter ultimately? Why wouldn't you seek, like, sort of a universal argument that is going to kill everybody, so to speak? You know,
So
like,
the
why
thing
is time being wasted on this?
The Sam Shamoun, and not just him, the Sam Shamoun, David Wood, the Christian Dawa script is oriented toward Sunnis and toward very Hadith heavy Sunnis. So even among Sunnis, there are different approaches to Hadith. An authentic Hadith in and of itself doesn't automatically get, I don't want to say scriptural status, but what's the word am I looking for?
Like secondary, like,
yeah, like just because you have a Hadith that's rated as authentic, that doesn't mean it becomes part of your belief, your theological belief system. It depends on what Sunni school you follow and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So let me see if I can give this will be useful for you, Lewis. Let me see if this is comparable. We have the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, and then we also have fragments from Papias about things that Jesus taught. For example, the talk about the millennium, bushes will give 10,000, fruits of grapes, and the grapes will compete with one another to be picked by a person here glorified. So is the Hadith kind of like Papias in comparison to the 4 Gospels? Like, these are traditions. Maybe some of them go back to Jesus, but they don't play any real theological authority, and you're not bound to them. Is it kind of like that?
Are you asking me or Lewis?
Well, I'm asking Lewis because the Papias example would be more familiar to him.
Okay, so can you reword that? So what about the Papias Millennium fragments?
So, for example, we have fragments of Papias where he recounts traditions about what the apostles Philip and his daughters did, about a saying of Jesus about in the millennium, vines will produce 10,000 branches, and the 10,000 branches will produce 10,000 grapes, and so on and so forth. Right? These are traditions that are from Papias. They're relatively early as far as traditions go, or maybe stories in Irenaeus, for example, about Jesus being 50 years old and so on. Are the Hadith like traditions like this, where you have traditions about what Jesus said and did in non-canonical authors, which may be interesting, but are ultimately not theologically essential to Christianity. Like you couldn't, in principle, be a Christian and just reject that story about Jesus, and it doesn't do anything for you.
Right. What like are you asking if I regard them as historically reliable or
No, I'm asking if the Hadith in comparison to the Quran is like Papias in comparison to the New Testament for Christianity.
I mean, it's very difficult to make that judgment call because I guess you can kind of almost see it that way. There's no real equivalent to hadith in the Christian tradition because we believe that whatever Jesus said, it's already in the four gospels, and anything that he may have said outside those four gospels is suspect at best. So
I've seen some Muslims say that these hadith, the ones that are authentic in nature, are just as authoritative as the Quran because they would say the Sunnah is divine revelation itself.
Right.
So they do, but the question is this: all Muslims, including us, we all believe that Muhammad's guidance outside the Quran is divinely inspired and equally authoritative as the Quran. We do believe that, but the issue then is that hadith are later memories of what Muhammad said. Right. So the hadith they may have the same you could say theological authoritativeness as the Quran, but they don't have the same epistemic weight as the Quran. So depending on what kind of Sunni you are, so if you are a Hanafi Sunni, you will only accept hadith that are mass transmitted as equal in weight to the Quran. And if you have like so this hadith that Lewis has quoted and a lot of people quote this, it's not mass transmitted. So already a lot of Sunnis have the grounds to just disregard it because they say this just doesn't have enough epistemic weight as whereas the Quran is mass transmitted and so on.
This sounds to me like a tradition that appears in one church father rather than a tradition that appears in a bunch of church fathers geographically spread. It sounds like something comparable.
I would actually push back on the idea this is not mass transmitted because I've actually spent some time combing through references to this particular tradition, and I've discovered variants of it in all sorts of places. I know it's in at least 3 of the 6 Sahih collections because I've found instances of it in Sahih Bukhari, Sunan Abi Dawud, and Jamia Tirmidhi. Outside of the Sahih Hadith collections, I've also found a version of it in Ibn Ishaq's Sirah, and also Al-Wahidi in his Kitab Asbab an-Nuzul mentions the story.
Aren't they a lot shorter, like a lot more truncated?
You have to look at both the chains. Like you would have to draw out the chains because what you often have is if Bukhari and Abu Dawud, for example, they may have the same hadith, but then if you look at the narrators, they'll like link up somewhere, So then it's like it's the illusion of mass transmission as opposed to actual mass transmission. So that's the thing. You have to sort of be careful. But the issue with this is let's just say it is mass transmitted. Let's say it was, right? But then you also have these sort of heavily transmitted hadith that say the opposite. That say like the Torah, the Jews corrupted the Torah or the book or whatever. So then a Sunni is going to look at all the data points on this, and they could, they're going to have to reconcile the data points, and that's why the Sunni opinion that developed historically is the Torah. Majority of Sunnis now would say the Torah is not preserved, right? But here's the issue. Let's say we grant that the Pentateuch is the same Torah, identical to the Torah the Quran talks about. Like let's just put that on the table, right? The reason why this was frustrating for me in the debate that we even went this way is my question was, where is the affirmation of the New Testament, not the Pentateuch, right? I will acknowledge that you do have it, and Lewis knows this because he read the book too, right? We can pick out like, I don't know, half a dozen pre-modern big name Islamic scholars who may have accepted the Pentateuch as preserved. But I can tell you, I don't know one, apart from certain modern scholars, from Sayyid Ahmed Khan onward, I don't know one who said, yeah, the New Testament is revelation. So this whole thing was unhelpful, and I didn't really see the point of Sam Shamoun like going in that direction.
And one more thing before we go into that, because you were trying to focus on the question of the New Testament, and there was this discussion about the Torah. But real quick, let's just say that hadith is somehow authentic and pervasive and authoritative. It still seems like there's still an issue of interpretation, because you can, number one, interpret it to mean that Muhammad is saying he affirms everything in that Torah, or he could be interpreted as saying, I affirm what is in you in reference to this particular ruling on adultery, not necessarily, touching on other things there. What do you think?
That's correct. That is correct. And the way these terms get used in Islamic sources, so the word Quran, today we hear Quran and we think of like the 114 chapter book, and we're like, that's the Quran. But the way the word Quran is used in the Quran and in the Hadith is that any verse.
I think we lost you there.
Or any chapter of, So I'll just
repeat the last sentence.
Sure, yeah. So these proper names, Torah, Quran, Kitab, we hear them today and we think of a corpus, right? So today, Quran means 114 chapters of 6,000 verses. But the way the word Quran is used in pre-modern Muslim sources, in the Hadith and in the Quran itself, the word Quran could mean one verse. It could mean 5 verses. It could mean one chapter. All of this could be called Quran. Like, even if one person recites one verse of the Quran, you'll say you recited the Quran, or you recited the Book of God or something. So we have to keep that in mind as well, that within the Quran itself, even a portion of something that's revealed, that one portion will still be called the Book of God, or the Kitab Allah, or the Quran, or whatever it is.
Now, as far as the question again of the New Testament, it seems like he hung his hat on 566, right? It seems like he was saying that third category, Torah, Gospel, and what has been revealed, what we discussed earlier. It seems like he was saying that's kind of a slam dunk for a reference to the 27 book New Testament. But I thought you offered an interesting insight that you would say it could be interpreted rather as Torah, Gospel, and what has been revealed to you, i.e. Quranic revelation.
Yeah, so that's a view that a lot of exegetes took, and it's plausible because, as first Stephen said, this phrase first occurs, the Quran is telling the prophet, right? If they had upheld the Torah and the Gospel and what has been sent down to them from their Lord. So we ask, okay, wait, what has been sent down to them? Well, I can tell you that there are many Quranic verses, including verses in Surah 5, that are addressed to the Jews and Christians. So it has actually been sent down to them. So that would be the first candidate. If I were interpreting the verse, that would be the most obvious meaning. That because Surah 5:15 begins, Ya Ahlul Kitab, all people of the book, and it's addressed to them. And if you go all over the Quran, there are several. I mean, there are many. I haven't done a count, but a good portion of the Quran, interestingly, is not talking to me. It's talking to you guys. So I would say that's the first candidate.
Yeah. Jump in here, Dr. Nemes. I think you had a question.
Yeah. I think about these things from the point of view of somebody who has a sympathy for historical critical readings of texts, literary readings. Again, one of the points that I want to emphasize and repeat here is that it seems to me that there is no reason why the Quranic text should be read in such a way that terms are understood in ways that are natural for Christians, especially if Christians are not being specifically addressed in the particular passages. This sort of thing happens all the time when it's about interpreting the New Testament. For example, you can pick up 5 commentaries on the Epistle to the Galatians, and you will find 5 different readings. People don't all have the same opinion about what Paul means when he talks about justification by faith, what he means by erga nomu, the works of the law. These are debated topics, whether he's talking about the Council of Jerusalem or about some other meeting with Peter, James, and John. So just as there are a variety of perspectives, and it's perfectly acceptable for somebody who is a Christian to read the Epistle of Galatians, in a sort of a historical, critical, assuming Paul's point of view, trying to enter into Paul's mind and to see what he was thinking. It seems to me that obviously you could read this particular passage about the Torah and the Injil and what has been revealed to you or what has been sent down to them in the way that he's suggesting, that it's talking about the Quran. I don't see what's impossible about that. And it seems to me that I will tell you from my point of view, as somebody who has no personal commitment to this argument, and I don't have sympathies for Islam, but I also don't have like a polemical interest in fighting against Islam. It seems to me like at certain points, this Islamic dilemma argument is desperate, and a Christian favorable interpretation of the Quranic text is being insisted upon, while a reasonable, Islamic favorable or Islam favorable interpretation is being resisted, but for reasons that I don't think are very good, or at least not very obviously good.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So you're pointing out that there's different ways to interpret this, and we don't necessarily have to interpret it in a way that is favorable to Christianity. You could steel man the Islamic perspective here. Yeah, I think that's a good point. If we're steel manning Islam, and that brings me to one of my questions here, Dr. Andani, that Sam brought up in the debate. I didn't hear a clear answer to, because I know there was a lot going on, so y'all weren't able to touch on everything. But I think he had pointed out that if this point was so clear from the Quran, as far as what divine revelation is being affirmed, then why were the Salaf not very clear on the question? Why were there different views among them?
So I don't think there were different views among the Salaf about that verse.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I can tell you that nobody among the Salaf and no no Sunni Quran exegete has ever thought that phrase, what has been revealed to you or what has been revealed to them from their Lord, means the New Testament. Nobody thought that. So actually, there's a pretty consistent position on that, right? So if Sam wanted to appeal to Muslim exegetical tradition for his reading, he won't find anybody who really affirms that. Now maybe some modern Muslims might, and again, like that would be very recent. Where I think he was saying that regarding the Torah, there were like different opinions about, and possibly the four gospel collection.
Yeah, because I think he was saying that some hold to the view that the Torah included the entire Old Testament canon.
Yeah.
Then
And
my
so,
question is, which Old Testament canon? And then others saw it as just the first 5 books. So why wasn't that point clear among the Salaf?
I think the simple answer to that is for several hundred years, the Muslim community isn't really, they don't have a familiarity with the Jewish and the Christian canon. Like at least let's say for about 200 years, right? So are these Salaf going and reading the Bible? No. It's usually these more highly literate people who are patronized scholars, like they're reading the Bible, and maybe some people who converted to Islam, they're reading the Bible. I don't even think the Salaf have a familiarity much, and that's why you'll find different views. But for me, this is what what rides on that argument. I'll just roll the.
You cut out on us there one more time, Dr. Andani.
Yeah.
Repeat that last sentence.
Yeah, so I would say that if this argument that within a religion we have a plurality of perspectives, if that somehow falsifies the whole religion, I'll throw it back at Christians, right? Like you guys have multiple denominations, you have multiple readings of like the whole faith alone versus faith and works. Why can't you agree, right? You have an Orthodox patriarch leadership versus the papal leadership. Why can't you agree? And then there's like 30,000 or God knows how many Protestant denominations exist. I mean, this is, to me, this is just not a compelling. It's just not a compelling argument. Also, like, I'm not Sunni, right? So I like this disagreement that he's citing. Like, it doesn't really touch me either way. And I'm not a Salafi. I don't really care what the Salaf have to say. The only Salaf that I follow are the Shia Imams. Yeah, and I'm a Shia. Did it cut out for a bit?
Yeah, last sentence. One more.
Sure.
One more
So
time. Yeah.
I'm Shia. Like, one of the reasons that I'm Shia and I'm not Sunni, right, is because the Shia have an infallible leadership. So the problem of this disputive interpretations is not a problem that I have because I'm in the Shia tradition.
Louis, go ahead, jump in here.
Okay, so this would be a good spot for me to bring up the thing that I posted on my Facebook. So I think you might have it there. If not, I can pull it up on my end.
I can pull it up here.
Sure, yeah. So it's funny that Dr. Andani mentions the fact that the early Muslims were unaware or did not have familiarity with the contents of the New Testament, because my entire critique of his critique of the Islamic dilemma is based around the lack of knowledge of the New Testament and its contents among the early Muslims, and I would argue by extension the Quran, because if I recall correctly, the first premise of the Islamic dilemma, as Khalil Andani presented it, is that the Quran acknowledges or confirms the 27 book canon of the New Testament. But as far as I know, there is not a single Christian apologist, including Sam or David Wood, who thinks that the Quran actually refers to the 27 book New Testament. And I don't think that the Quran is referring to the 27 book New Testament. And
they say that the Quran confirms the New Testament. Like, yeah, that's how that they claim. So how does this work?
So here's the thing. Because I don't think that the Quran actually knows about the 27 book New Testament. From my reading of the entire Quran and all the references to the Injil that's contained therein, I don't see any evidence that the author of the Quran even knows that the Christians have a collection of 27 books that they call the New Testament. It just knows about something called the Injil and connects it in some way to Jesus. So,
but does it define the Injil as the New Testament?
Yeah.
Or like the New Testament?
Yeah. Because even if I recall correctly, if you may have seen that David Wood actually did a review of your debate, and one of the things he mentioned is that he'll grant, for the sake of argument, that the Injil, for purposes of the debate, only refers to Jesus' direct words. That doesn't change the substance of the argument.
I mean, I think it really does, personally. I think that should, firstly, let me say this. I've heard David Wood on YouTube. I can't tell you the video. I've heard David Wood say this dilemma, and he says the Quran confirms the inspiration, authority, and preservation of the New Testament. And then what he does often is he uses the term gospel to refer to the New Testament, which is a very modern, like, evangelical thing to do. I've heard that. I've also seen Sam's own websites. Sam uses these mistranslations of the Quran. If you saw it during the debate, he has the verses where instead of Torah and gospel, it says Old Testament and New Testament. So their dilemma argument is riding on the New Testament. So if they now say that, look, we're not saying the Quran affirms the New Testament, I think that's a big win. I think that's a huge concession. Yeah. But let's go to what you said. So you would say, I read your comments, you would say that the Quranic author just doesn't know about the contents or the nature of the Christian canon. Is that correct?
That is correct. I have no reason to believe that the Quran knows what the Christian canon even contains.
Okay, so that perspective, if the Islamic dilemma is a theological argument, okay, and then I respond to it theologically, then I just wouldn't hold that perspective, because I'm the Muslim that the dilemma is being presented to. So I believe in the Quran, and I believe the author of the Quran is divinely inspired, right, with knowledge that a normal human doesn't have access to. So for me, I would simply assume, if I'm doing it theologically, I could simply assume that, yeah, the Quranic author does know what the New Testament is. And instead of affirming that New Testament, he defines the gospel as the words of Jesus, and then he opposes all these ideas that Christians are getting from the New Testament. Like, that would be the theological approach. But let's say I looked at it a different way, right? So let's say I was looking at this without any theological commitment. So now I'm just sort of analyzing the Quran as a text, right? With a 7th century author. I would still argue that on textual grounds, right, the Quranic author, A, defines the gospel in a way that doesn't match the New Testament, and I think everybody will agrees with that, okay? And B, he actively, consciously opposes, revises, and rectifies ideas in the New Testament, like actual content of the New Testament. The Quran is opposing, correcting, and rectifying. And the Imran al-Badawi's book has very, very concrete examples of the Quran's engagement with the New Testament, like actual texts. So when you combine those two data points, right, the gospel is defined in a way that it's not the New Testament, and then New Testament passages, teachings are rectified and opposed by the Quran. I don't know where the premise of the Quran confirms the New Testament, how can that be sustained now, even like academically, like without my Muslim commitments?
Okay, so I will speak to the al-Badawi quotes because I saw them, and I don't think they prove that the Quran is interacting with or correcting the New Testament. And the reason why I don't think that is because none of the passages that are cited as such actually refer to the New Testament. They refer to certain ideas that happen to also be in the New Testament, but it doesn't tell us where the Quran found those ideas from. It's entirely possible.
That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. If you've read Badawi's book, he provides us with very clear intertextual connections between the Aramaic Gospels, some of the Pauline stuff, and the Quran. And he has he ran like actual data, like he ran some sort of computer analysis to give us like percentages. Now, let's say for the sake of argument, right, that the New Testament content, again, from Aramaic Gospel and some Pauline stuff, let's say Muhammad didn't actually go pick up a New Testament and read it. Okay, he didn't get it that way. Through some, let's say through Christian preaching, right? So we have Christian missionaries or Christian preachers, holy men maybe in Arabia. They would preach out of the New Testament, which I think you guys that's not that's what you do, right? Like you quote the scripture, right? Or you paraphrase the scripture. So Muhammad, through his, again, I'm doing this as an academic because some Muslims are now going to get mad at me and say, oh, so just as an academic exercise. So Muhammad, throughout his life, he was exposed to Christian oral preaching that's right out of the New Testament. Okay, so he heard all those verses that Badawi intertexts with the Quran. Muhammad heard them quoted, right? Yeah. And when Christians quote scripture, I and you correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but when a scripture is quoted, like they will say, I'm quoting like the scripture. I'm quoting the book, or I'm quoting the thing. So
not always. Yeah, a lot of preachers will allude to scripture without saying that they're quoting scripture. Happens all the time.
So they'll quote something, they'll present it as authoritative, right? So now Muhammad will hear this, and then the Quran, which in the academic view is the words of Muhammad, the Quran goes and opposes all this stuff. So now the content of the New Testament, a large part of it, is being opposed by the Quranic author. At the same time, the Quranic author never confirms the 4 Gospels or the 27 books. He confirms something else called the Gospel. So now all the data together, how could any sane person say, oh, the Quran confirms the New Testament, but it opposes its teachings? This is what I'm wondering.
Okay, I have a quick response to that.
And
so
then Stephen has a comment too.
All right, I'll let Stephen go first.
Yeah, I'm just curious. What actually is the relevance of the thing that you're bringing up, Lewis, for the Islamic dilemma? Because let's say that the Quran does not know about the New Testament. It does not know about the canonical text. When the Quran affirms something that Christians have, and it calls it the Injil, and it says that, this Injil that you have from Jesus, this is good, I affirm this. That's consistent with rejecting the New Testament, maybe even very substantial ideas that are in the New Testament. It's consistent with rejecting Orthodox Christian dogma, because it's still possible to say that you are wrong about the things that you think are important, but you still have something that I think is really important and that you do have from God. So I just don't understand how it assists the argument at all to say that the Quran doesn't know about the New Testament or whatever.
I'm mainly countering the counter argument against the Islamic dilemma, and the counter against the Islamic dilemma is premised around the idea that the Quran at least knows the content of the New Testament enough to consciously reject or correct it, which is the part that I am arguing against. Now, with regards to the scenario that we were talking about, so let's say, we have that scenario about the preachers quoting scripture, and Muhammad hears this. Let's even say, for the sake of argument, that these aforementioned preachers explicitly say, I'm quoting from the scriptures. I would like to remind everybody that there is an accusation of oral corruption, and it's quite explicit in the Quran itself. So if we could pull up the screen for a second. So this is Surah Al Imran, ayah 78, where it says, وَإِنَّ مِنْهُمْ لِفَرِيقًا يَلَؤُونَ أَلْسِنَاتِهِمْ بِالْكِتَابِ. So in English it says, there are those who twist the scripture with their tongues. So within the Quran itself, there is this acknowledgement that there are certain people who will say certain things and will claim it to be scriptural revelation, but they are orally twisting it, which is fully consistent with the scenario we were just talking about, but doesn't lead to the charge of textual corruption, only oral corruption.
So I would disagree, actually. You know why? Because your translation presumes that they're taking a text, right, and then they're misrepresenting a physical text. Is that correct?
Well, that would be the face value understanding of what a kitab is, but I know you have your...
That's wrong. This is just not correct. We have so much scholarship now, mine being the latest, that when the Quran uses the word kitab, you can't just think, okay, so they're reading a physical book. What this is actually saying is that there are people who distort the authentic divine revelation, okay, with their tongues to make you think that what they're saying with their tongues is authentic revelation, but it's not. So they claim that something is from Allah, but it's not. Now, this charge would also cover the contents of the New Testament, because the contents of the New Testament are preached, which everybody agrees. In fact, we know that from the everyday life of most Jews and Christians before we have mass paper, the scripture is primarily something experienced as oral, not written, right? We don't have a bunch of Protestants running around 7th century Arabia like we do today, and like you used to be, Lewis, and with the kind of Protestant that Stephen used to be in the reading Bibles. So you have a Christian preacher in Arabia who is preaching or giving an oratory, right? And they're enunciating something from from one of the Gospels or from John, right? So it's oral in that sense, and they're claiming in their proclamation that what I'm reciting is the gospel or it's from God. And that's what the Quran calls kitab. And the Quran is coming saying, no, it's not. So
you're
actually, yeah.
You're suggesting, Khalil, that kitab, which is translated there scripture, does not have to be translated as scripture. It can be translated in this other way as revelation. And if you
Yeah.
translate it as revelation, then this whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, this argument the argument falls apart, where if kitab is no longer seen as something like a definite physical corpus, which again, that's not the Quranic usage of kitab. When the Quran wants to talk about a corpus of actual texts, it will use other words like suhuf, for example. And there are some reference, like when the Quran wants to refer to a text, either a lost text or a present text, it'll refer to suhuf. Even heavenly texts, which are not even physical, will sometimes they're called suhuf. That's why the Quran in written form is called a mushaf. Whereas when the Quran is referred to as with respect to its divine revelatory nature, it's called a kitab. So that's what.
So
kitab
is mushaf like etymologically related to suhuf, the SHF? Are those the connections?
Yes. So interestingly, the word Bible and the word like Bible is from biblos, right?
Biblion, yeah.
Yeah. So Bible, biblion, and also sefer, right? Those denote physical text. Like they actually refer to the actual paper of a thing. Kitab, the meaning of kitab in Arabic, it doesn't refer to the actual paper. It has more of the meaning of ordered arrangement. That's why the same root, kaf, ta, and ba in Arabic, that same root forms the word for battalion, because a battalion is an arrangement. So kitab has more of the sense of order or arrangement as opposed to like paper.
I understand.
But going
so
back to the point, right? The point I'm making is, let's take Lewis's scenario. The author of the Quran, again, as an academic, author of Quran, he doesn't know anything about a 27 book New Testament. Okay, he doesn't know, like he's not aware of that. So if he's not aware of it, he can't affirm it, for starters. Like you can't affirm and say this thing that I don't even know of. I don't even know this exists. This is from God. You can't affirm something that you don't know anything about, right? So that's a problem. But B, he affirms something that's different from the 27 book New Testament, okay, the gospel of Jesus. And then he opposes all of these teachings down to the actual text blocks that are found within the New Testament, even if those teachings reached the prophet through Christian oral preaching. He still opposes it. So what I'm saying is all the data will go against premise one.
Okay, fair enough.
Did you have other? I'm trying to see where.
Yeah, I did have a bunch of others. Now, a lot of the discussion has to do with trying to identify the content of the idea of the gospel. Now, while I do hold to a version of the Islamic dilemma, I don't believe that. I mean, at least the version of the Islamic dilemma that I would use would not require me to identify the Injil with any kind of written text. So I'm willing to grant everything that you've said up to this point. I'm willing to grant that kitab, means an ordered revelation that doesn't necessarily have to be in a written form. And I'm also willing to grant that the Injil in the Quranic conception only refers to the message that Jesus directly conveyed.
Right.
But I don't think that necessarily refutes the Islamic dilemma, or at the very least, it doesn't refute all versions of the Islamic dilemma.
So could you tell me if you conceded the thing on again? I'm not saying you actually do, but just for argument's sake, right? So if you concede the thing on what kitab means, if you
Yeah.
concede that the
Yeah,
Quranic
that
Injil,
part I'm willing to concede because that one is I think is a ancillary point. It's not, it doesn't affect the main points that I'm trying to make.
right? So then can you then maybe you could help me then? Where's the dilemma now? So
Okay.
we
So
don't have a new, like, what is the Quran confirming that gets the Quran into a dilemma? Because it's hard for me to see.
yeah. So yeah, because if I was having this debate with you instead of Sam Shamoon, I would present the Islamic dilemma a little differently. So what I would say is that, okay, I'll agree that the Injil is the message of Jesus. Now the next question I would have is, okay, if the Injil is the message of Jesus, what we should now ask is, how are we going to identify the message of Jesus? Where do we go in order to find the message of Jesus? And this is where, I start to think more like a Catholic than a Protestant, because when I think the message of Jesus, I think in terms not just of Scripture, even though Scripture is a vehicle by which that message is transmitted, but the entirety of what we would refer to as apostolic tradition. And here's where I would bring in something that wasn't really brought up as much during the debate, which is the role of the Hawariyun. So you're familiar with the fact that in Surat Al-Imran, Surat As-Saf, for example, it refers to Jesus' disciples. It even refers to them as Muslimun, etc.
Yeah.
So the way I would understand it, the Quran is affirming that these Hawariyun are authentic followers of Jesus, and thus would make them bearers of his message. That would be accurate to say, right?
Yeah, it presents them in a very high light. Does it present them as infallible? I don't think so, but it presents them as followers of Jesus. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Now, there are two places in the Quran, Surah 355 and Surah 61, I believe 61:14, which talks about the fact that the Hawariyun are made superior to those who disbelieve. Now,
I believe Sam quoted that, but he did it in the Q&A, so I couldn't respond to it. But
I know it was brought up in passing, but see, if I was doing things, I would actually press that point a lot harder than Sam.
So then you should press it. Go ahead. So tell us what the verse would say. Maybe you want to quote one or two of them.
Sure. Let me actually pull up one of them right now.
Can I ask a question? What are the Hawariyun or whatever? What are those?
The disciples. It's the Quran refers to the disciples of Jesus, right? Several.
That means like the 12 apostles, or what?
Yeah, presumably, yeah.
Yeah. So here in Surah 3,
Jesus says, so before we get to 355, there are other verses. Jesus says, for example, although the wording is very interesting, he says, who will be my helpers to Allah? Like he's like, who's going to be my helpers? And then these disciples, they say, again, the wording is very interesting. They say, we will be Allah's helpers. Okay. So already, I love showing this. It's a bit of a tangent, Louis, but I love showing this to Salafis. You know why?
Why?
Just look at the wording. So what do Salafis usually tell us about the issue of intercession of the Prophet and the saints, right? What do the Salafis say? The Salafis say, like our Protestant friends, that like you should only ask God for help. Right? You should not ask a creature for help. But if you look at the wording here, first Jesus asked for help, and he's not asking God. He's asking the disciples to be his helpers, right? And then the disciples say, we will be God's helpers.
I want to make a comment here also. This is a tangential point, but I just want to make a little polemical jab here and then move on. We can talk about it in detail another time. If Jesus asked, who will be my helper in God's cause? And the disciples respond, we will be God's helpers. Now, if you have your early high Christology mania on, you would read this somehow as being an implicit affirmation of Jesus' divinity on the part of his disciples, because Jesus is asking, who's going to help me? And the disciples say, we're going to help God. And then you can put your argument together and say, oh, here they're affirming that he's God. Now, I presume that the Quranic author does not mean to affirm that Jesus is God. So to me, what's interesting about this verse is that it shows how unnatural and how sort of theologically motivated these kinds of readings of small little passages like these are. But I realize that I'm just provoking Lewis here, so I'll let that one go.
Yeah, that was an interesting thought.
It doesn't even say God's cause, although like that's probably the meaning. It says, "Who will be my helpers to
Illallah.
God, like unto God or toward God." So the interesting thing is for intra-Muslim debates is why is Jesus asking for help from other than God? Because you're only supposed to ask God for help according to certain Salafi Muslims. So why is the prophet Jesus asking humans for help? And then the people who help Jesus say, we will be God's helpers. Wait a minute. God needs help too now? Right? So it just shows how, like, the like certain hyper literal readings of scriptures, including the Quran, like it sort of leads you to some odd places. But anyway, Lewis, go ahead. So you have this verse,
Yeah. So the key verse for me is Ayah 55, where it says, I will make those who follow you superior to those who disbelieve. Now, the Christian view, of course, is that, when Jesus appointed his 12 apostles, as well as 70 disciples, and then when he ascended back into heaven, he entrusted the work of spreading the gospel to these aforementioned apostles and disciples. And then over time, those get codified into written text. That's where we get the New Testament. But because I'm a Catholic, I don't necessarily limit the message to just that New Testament. It also includes the apostolic preaching as well. So basically, my version of the Islamic dilemma, if you want a simplified version of it, it basically swaps out the New Testament with apostolic tradition.
Okay.
Purposes of the debate.
So that's really interesting, and maybe at some point, so I consider that a different argument. I mean, you can call it the dilemma, that's fine, but like this is a different argument, which is interesting. So did you want to point? You had said there was another verse you wanted to. So just explain to me. Are you saying that this verse affirms like the high status of Jesus' apostles, right? And then based on apostolic succession, this verse and maybe this one over here would be supporting like the Catholic Christianity, which is apostolic. Is that the idea?
Yes. Although, ironically enough, I first thought about this argument during my Protestant phase. Just goes to show you how consistently I was thinking at the time. But the idea here is basically that, because if you listen to a lot of Muslim narratives, they'll say that, Jesus' apostles, they originally preached the pure message of Jesus, but over time it was corrupted by that dastardly Paul. But see, when I think about it, if that is what took place, then that basically nullifies Surah 355 and Surah 61:14, because in that scenario, the unbelievers have prevailed over the believers, which makes these two passages false.
Okay. Do you want to add anything else to that? Then Stephen has something to say, and then I'll respond too. I wanted to respond to this to Sam, but the format didn't allow me. But do you want to add anything else? So is the idea here that the Quran says those who believed in Jesus will prevail and are superior to those who did kufr, who disbelieved, i.e. rejected Jesus, and therefore, it's, as you understand it, those who believe in Jesus is the Christian church. So the Quran is endorsing the validity of the church. Is that the idea?
That's an oversimplified version of it, but and more to the point, the idea is that it's endorsing what, as a Catholic, I would call apostolic tradition, because the contrary scenario is that the unbelievers prevailed, which the Quran explicitly says they would not.
Okay. So Stephen, you I know you have something to say. I have something to say after, but go ahead. Yeah.
I think that, again, in this situation, you are reading this text in a Christian way that I think the Muslim doesn't feel any need to do or doesn't have any necessity in doing. I understood the text to be referring to Jesus's, let's say, immediate disciples, and presumably the the victory of the disciples over the unbelievers has to do with the, like, let's say, their eschatological destiny, or they go to heaven when they die, or something along those lines. I don't think that it has anything to do with apostolic succession. In part because I don't believe in apostolic succession. I don't believe that actually happened. I think that was a myth. It was made up. So I think, again, you are taking certain contested Christian ideas and using them to read the text in a way that's unfavorable to Islam. I don't see the necessity for the Quranic author to mean that. Like, what? Presume there was an interesting passage where it said that I'm going up to God and I will bring you up to me. That is what I understood it to mean, that the disciples are going to go up to heaven with Jesus after death. That's what their victories can say. It's not going to be the same for the unbelievers who disbelieved in him. So that, it seems to me, is the victory. To connect it with apostolic succession is to presuppose this entire conception of who the apostles were and later Christian history that not only is contentious in its own right, but presumably has nothing to do with what Muhammad is talking about if he doesn't even know about a New Testament. How will he know about apostolic succession and the bishops and all this, but he doesn't even know about the New Testament? That, it seems to me, highly implausible.
I have something to say, but Lewis, it's your argument. So do you want to respond first?
Yeah. So it doesn't require the author of the Quran to have known about the actual concept of apostolic tradition itself, or the idea of apostolic succession, or the church hierarchy. It just requires the Quran to have been aware that there was a group of people known as the Hawariyun, and that those group were made to prevail over against their opponents. So I guess the hinge of the argument would be, what would you understand prevailing or being made superior to mean in the context of Surah 355 and 61:14?
So if you think, for example, that if you're a Muslim, let's say, and you think that putting other persons alongside God in worship is a sin, it seems to me you could very easily read this text to refer to the sort of the Jewish Christian Ebionite tradition, which prevailed over the other part of Christianity because it resisted the temptation to put Jesus or some other beings alongside God. It maintained the unicity, the uniqueness and the oneness of God, and it maintained the original revelation and the teaching of Jesus. So it seems to me like you could, I think, my experience, I don't know very much about this, but in my experience, Muslims tend to be very favorable toward Ebionite and Jewish Christian approaches, precisely for reasons of their low Christology and their very strict monotheism. So why couldn't you just read the passage in this way, as referring to Jesus' disciples who taught Ebionite Christianity, who prevailed because they did not commit idolatry or whatever it is when you put a second alongside God? And why couldn't you read it in that way?
Yeah. Well, I'm going by how these passages have been understood by a lot of commentators that I've read, admittedly Sunni. Maybe the Shi'i view would be a little different, but a lot of them would say that prevailing or coming out on top is something that happens in this life. So it's not some kind of eschatological vindication, but the believers will actually succeed in propagating their faith more successfully than the unbelievers. In fact, it's funny because in early Islam, that was precisely the argument that the Muslims were making in favor of Islam. If we must be the true religion because look at how much success we're having. So in a sense, you can see the Quran as back projecting that same argument onto the first century disciples.
Well, I want to make a distinction here, because you can say that their prevailing takes place in this life, but to say that it's a matter of their numeric superiority in comparison to their theological rivals is something else altogether. Because presumably the refusal to go along with the high Christology trend and to put a second alongside God and so on, that also happens in this life. So you can say that their prevailing happens in this life, but it doesn't follow that it's a matter of the expanse of their religion in comparison. I just think those are two different things.
So I want to comment on this point. So firstly, can you put my screen share on the thing, Michael? I'm just going to put the verse back up, and then I have other verses here. All right, here's one of the verses. So I want to notice two things. So this word here, this gets translated disbelieve, but you have to in Quranic context, kufr and kafara as a verb. Kufr means to conceal or to cover over. Kafara here, or kafaru, means to actually do that. And this is used for people in the Quran. It's not just about believing. It's like those who like they don't believe in a messenger, but they oppose him. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Jews and Christians who don't believe in Muhammad as a prophet, they are not all called kafirs, disbelievers. Only the Jews and Christians who like oppose Muhammad militarily, right? Only they're called kafirs. So I would translate. I wouldn't just see this as like those who believe in Jesus versus like those who don't believe in Jesus. I would say those who those who so-called disbelieve here, and then they're mentioned over here. So those God will make those who followed you, Jesus. Folk just means above, by the way. It just means above. Those who follow you will be above those who oppose you, like oppose Jesus.
Is that referring to the Jews of his lifetime or what?
So this is how I read it. Jesus was opposed by a Jewish faction and, let's say, Romans during his lifetime. So the Jewish faction, the anti-Jesus Jewish faction, probably the Sadducees, maybe. You guys know better than me, right? Some of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, you know, the so-called corrupt high priest, right? And the Romans, they are those who disbelieve in Jesus. Like they oppose Jesus, right? These other Jews, Pharisees who had neither, they're not really the disbelievers. Like it's these certain people. So I would argue that actually the followers of Jesus, like the disciples and the first generation, second generation, they won because that whole the Romans eventually are sort of defeated, right, in some way or another. And more importantly, the Jewish faction who opposed Jesus is gone. They don't really exist. Like that whole temple-centered Judaism, it sort of went with like the destruction of the temple. Like the Sadducees are gone. So I would argue that that's what that refers to. Now, the other thing is, if these were the only two verses, the ones that you showed me, that you showed Lewis, this one and Surah 61, which talk about the followers or disciples of Jesus in a high sense. But wait a minute, doesn't the Quran have more to say about Christians than just those two verses, including like the apostolic Christianity that's prevalent in Arabia, these like church-based Christianity? Isn't there more to be said? So I would say, yeah. So here's what I have. And again, I didn't get to share this. The Quran indicts Christians, like this is established Christianity, it indicts Christians of like of basically going astray. First example over here, Surah 5, verse 14. And from those who say we are Christians, we took their covenant, but they neglected a portion of what they had been commanded to uphold. So we let hostility and enmity arise between them until the day of judgment, and Allah will soon inform them of all they've done. This is about Christians. So this is a criticism of established Christianity, right? This would include like the Catholic Church or the Orthodox don't exist. So it includes like that this sort of mainline small C Catholic Church. Then in another part of the Quran, in Surah 57, this is very interesting. It talks about Noah, Abraham, their progeny, their followers, other messengers that God sent after Noah and Abraham, among whom is Jesus, okay, son of Mary. We gave him the gospel. We placed in the hearts of those who followed him leniency, mercy, and clergy, which they perverted, and that which we did not command it of them, except rather for the desire to please God. However, they did not care for it as they should have been cared for. We gave to those among them who believed their wage, but many of them are corrupt. So this is saying that among the followers of Jesus, there are actually two groups. There's one group, which is many, who innovated and who are corrupt. And there's another group, a smaller group, that has faith, that believed. Now, this is already telling you that you don't have a blanket Quranic praise or approval of apostolic Christianity. Now, I'm going to show you what Imran al-Badawi says about those same passages I just read to you. Imran al-Badawi, and I think he's right because there's other data for this. For Imran al-Badawi, this passage is a criticism of the early church who gave up the law, basically, like the Gentile Pauline church who sort of went totally against keeping the Jewish law or any of the law. The Quran sees the clergy of this now perverted church, Paul and his camp, as corrupt, right? And then it's the Jewish Christians that are the minority who still believe. And then on top of that, I would add that if you examine the Christology of the Quran, like the theological claims the Quran makes about Jesus, from a historical perspective, this matches closest to the Christology of the Ebionites, known as Jewish Christians. And there's a 2-part article by the scholar Patricia Crona, who Lewis is quite familiar with because we had to read her in undergrad, right? Patricia Crona has a 2-part article, and she makes this very strong hypothesis that the Quran is trying to restore the Christology of the Jewish Christians, and a lot of the Quranic statements about Jesus as a prophet, as a Messiah, Jesus as a prophet to the Israelites, Jesus as Torah affirming. She says this matches the Jewish Christian Christology. So I think if there is a Christianity that the Quran endorses, it's not the small c apostolic Christianity. And on an entirely different point, which we don't have to get into now, I think if we read, and Lewis will disagree, and so will Michael, and that's fine, but there is a contingent of modern scholarship of the historical Jesus, led by people like James Tabor and Jeffrey Butts and maybe Bruce Chilton. There's several of these scholars who do believe that the Jerusalem church led by James, out of which the Ebionites claim to be the bearers of that legacy, that they do believe that that type of Jewish Christianity more accurately represents the message and the theological vision of the historical Jesus. So if the Quran is restoring Jewish Christian Christology, which I believe it is, there's a historical basis to what the Quran is saying.
Now, if we were to go this route, we would have to establish that whatever the Ebionites believed would more or less correspond with what the early Muslims believed. Because if we found that there were certain things that the Ebionites taught that are also at odds with Islam, that would kind of put a damper on this argument. Would you agree?
Well, what do you mean by early Muslims? Because as you know, early Muslims, like the first 100 years, we have like so many different sects. So I think I would put it more simply. What is the relationship between Quranic Christology and the early Jewish Christian, which will later be called Ebionite Christology? Yes. I think it will go into that.
Okay, so let's look at a couple of data points. So it's actually, first of all, it's a little, we had actually a guest on Reason and Theology a while back, Matthew Schmidt, who talked about the use of the Ebionites in Islamic apologetics. And one of the things that he has pointed out is that it is notoriously difficult to actually reconstruct what the Ebionites believed. But at least some permutations of what we think the Ebionites may have believed would actually contradict Islam as well. So, for example, it is possible that some of the Ebionites may have held to an adoptionist Christology. Now, we know that—
I think that's a sub, but that's not universal to all the Ebionites, right? That's like a specific group of them, if I recall.
I'm not 100% clear on that particular point. So it may have been just some of them, may have been all of them. It's a little unclear. Another issue is that it seems that at least some of the Ebionites also rejected the virgin birth, which would be problematic because the Quran affirms the virgin birth. So if there were groups of Ebionites that either affirmed adoptionist Christology or denied the virgin birth, then they would also be disbelievers rather than Muslims from a Quranic paradigm.
Again, I would say go, and maybe you've read it. but to the audience, if there's a positive argument for what I'm saying, it's from Patricia Crona. This is 2 peer-reviewed journal articles. It's called Jewish Christianity and the Quran, published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 2015. She is not a Muslim apologist. I mean, Patricia Crona was one of the most, like, she's one of the most well-respected historians of early Islam. And Lewis, you know who she is. So, like, I would encourage people, like, I'm not making an apologetic argument here. Like, I'm making a historical argument. Like, if we, like, forget if the Quran is true or not. Take the Quran's Christology and then simply ask a historical question. What Christian group has the closest Christology to what's in the Quran? Which one? It's going to be the Jewish Christian Ebionites. Will it match? Exactly no, because remember, the last account we have of the Ebionites is from Eusebius. And what is he, 4th century, Lewis? Stephen? What?
Yeah,
Eusebius
actually,
is in the 4th century.
one could
Okay.
argue. I think they might have been mentioned in Irenaeus as
They
well.
are mentioned in Irenaeus, and in,
I mean
and in
the
Irenaeus.
latest.
Oh, latest,
yeah.
yeah.
The
It's
latest.
going to be either Eusebius or Epiphanius, one or the other.
So, like, the last description we have of Ebionites is like 4th century, assuming that their information is current, which it might not be. 4th century. Muhammad and the Quran are 7th century. There's a lot that can happen in 3 centuries. That Ebionite tradition can still develop. But then I'm just saying that, like, forget if the Quran is true. If you just read the Quran as a historical document of an author in a very sectarian environment who's making claims about Jesus and God, if we have to tie that Quranic author, his Christology, to a historical current, it would be Jewish Christian Ebionite Christology. Like, that's the one that matches the most, even if you think they're wrong. Yeah.
I will say this: the scholars think that to talk about Ebionites is already sort of to combine groups that had some things in common and probably differed on certain things. There were varieties of Jewish Christians, just like there are varieties of every kind of Christian. And Ebionite is a category that Irenaeus uses, but which does not necessarily correspond to a single unique group. It's common enough that Irenaeus refers to, like, Gnostics, or he refers to Ebionites, but he just gives one label for a large group that is internally diverse. So again, I also think there's this point. I don't see why the Quran has to be referring to Ebionites. It has to be referring to people who were self-described followers of Jesus and who understood its message in a manner acceptable to the Quran. But it does not have to match on to any of the categories that we have from Christian theological history, like in Irenaeus or whatever. These are just 2 different things. In Irenaeus's mind, there is this category of people called Ebionites, and they all have these various things in common. But the Quranic author does not have to be looking at things through this lens of Irenaeus. So it could well be that what the Quranic author is referring to does not have a clear category in Christian theological history, but is nevertheless a real thing. That's all that's required. If we're so again, I think, like, I just don't see really the, let's say that there were Ebionites who didn't believe in the virgin birth or whatever. Who cares? Because it's the Quran is not saying that the people that Irenaeus referred to as Ebionites are the real ones. It's just saying that there were, followers of Jesus who understood him correctly, and that doesn't have to match on to Irenaeus's categories.
Yeah, see, that does create a problem, because so if we're trying to identify who the Hawariyun are, either they're a group that does not appear to have ever actually existed in history, or they're a group whose history is so muddled in the depths of time that we have extreme trouble even trying to reconstruct them.
Yeah, but notice, Lewis, this is exactly what happens in the cases of the Bible. Everything that the Old Testament talks about is not easily historically reconstructed, and we cannot easily find out who all the people mentioned in the Bible are. Most of the people mentioned in the Bible we have next to no evidence for whatsoever, except for the New Testament texts themselves. So, I mean, if this is presented simply as an internal critique of Islam, that doesn't matter. Now, if you want to say, like, what grounds are there for accepting the Quranic description of history, you have to throw your hands up, because we just don't have the evidence available to confirm or deny various claims. But the same thing is true for the Bible also. The Bible also makes claims that can neither be confirmed nor denied definitively by means of available historical evidence. And in many cases, the only thing we have to go on is what the Bible itself says. So it seems like this is just an argument that could very easily be turned against you.
I would just say this, Lewis. The Quranic the disciples of Jesus did exist, right? I mean, we all believe, you concede that. So when the Quran talks about the disciples of Jesus, that's a real thing, right? The difference is the Quran thinks the disciples of Jesus are non-Trinitarian Jewish monotheists. Would you agree? Like, that's how the Quran.
That would be how the Quran would look at it, right?
Right. Now look, I'm going to ask you, don't most historians think that the disciples of Jesus were Jewish non-Trinitarian monotheists? Isn't that what historian, like, no, I don't know any historian, not theologian. I don't know any historian who will say Peter, James, John were Trinitarians.
Yeah. With all due respect, I feel like you're doing a little bit of a Mott and Bailey type argument here, because
I don't know what that means.
Because you're arguing on the basis of, one particular point, which is whether they were Trinitarians or not. I'm arguing on the basis of whether they believe the overall Quranic conception of Christ.
Yeah, so Jesus is a prophet.
Yeah,
he's a human. He's a prophet. He's the Messiah of the Israelites, right? He preached the Torah. He also preached this sort of inner meaning of the Torah laws, which is the gospel, the hikmah, right? And what else is there?
Yeah,
and he had that's basically it, right? And it's Unitarian. It's not Trinitarian. Jesus didn't claim to be God, so there's no deity of Christ, and there's no substitutionary atonement. So that's the Quranic Christology in a nutshell. So honestly, does this not have a? I mean, can I not say that there's a historical argument that the disciples of Jesus, for whatever access we have to them, that this was their belief system? I mean, we know they're Jewish. We know they observe Torah, right? I don't think we have much evidence that the actual disciples talked about the Trinity, or that Jesus taught the Trinity. I know you think Jesus taught. Maybe you think Jesus preached that his own deity, and the disciples saw him as God in some way, but I think that's highly disputed. And I would point to, even just in the Christian memory, like the book of Acts has a memory of Peter, the disciple of Jesus, his preaching to the Israelites. And when I read it, that seems closer to Quranic Christology than a Catholic Christology. And I don't mean any offense when I say that, but that's just what I think. So I mean, I know you disagree with me, and that's fine, but like, I don't think I'm on flimsy ground when I draw a parallel or an alignment between Quranic Christology and a historically reconstructed, early Jewish Christian Christology.
All right. So I do have a couple of points in response to that. First of all, let's say, for the sake of argument, that I'm going to become a Unitarian now and agree with Stephen Nemes, okay? Let's say the New Testament teaches a Unitarian Christology, okay?
Well, that was easy. I wasn't expecting this.
Okay, but this is part of, this is part of my, for the sake of argument thing.
Sure,
Even a Unitarian Christology doesn't necessarily mean a Quranic Christology, because there are, Unitarianism in and of itself is a fairly broad category. There are different flavors of it, but among other things, most Unitarians will concede that Jesus can be referred to as God in a small g derivative sense, because there's a bunch of passages in the New Testament that refer to Jesus that way. But in a Quranic conception, you can't call Jesus God in any sense, not even in that small g derivative sense. So you're right there. There's already a disconnect between the two viewpoints.
But hold on a second. But
I don't think, though, the Jewish disciples. Sorry, Stephen. I'll just say one thing. I don't think the Jewish disciples of Jesus historically would have called him God. Okay, I could be wrong. I don't think they would have. I think, though, once the memory of Jesus and the disciples is now transmitted into this more of a Greek vocabulary, right? Then maybe you have statements like that. But I'm not talking about, when I say like Quranic Christology and early Jewish Christian Christology, I mean early Jewish Christian Christology. I don't mean like today's biblical Unitarians. I mean, I think they still believe in substitutionary atonement. They still
Yes.
think you can worship Jesus, right? I mean, Dale tell you they think Jesus should be
Yeah.
worshipped.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about this other sort of earlier Christology, which we have to reconstruct historically. But
I think again, there's a dependence of your argument, Lewis, on the New Testament, which is question begging in the present context. Because when the Quran makes a statement about what Jesus's earliest disciples believed and how they thought,
Mhm.
that does not mean that that statement has to be true if it can be confirmed with the New Testament. Because again, Khalil's whole point is that the Quran does not confirm the New Testament. It does not grant the validity of the New Testament. So your argument is presuming that the New Testament is a reliable testimony to what the earliest disciples of Jesus taught. I don't see why Khalil has to grant that point when that's I think something that you have to prove. Because
Okay, but
this has been Khalil's point again and again. He says, where is the notion that the Quran accepts the New Testament? That doesn't exist.
But if you look at it from a secular historical Jesus perspective, even a lot of them would concede that, almost from the get-go, Christians were directing their devotion and their worship to Jesus.
But I don't agree that that's obvious. I don't agree that that's obvious. Cases, for example, so here's a point. There are certain scholars who will place the New Testament, the composition of the New Testament, into the 2nd century. This is a major thing that is beginning to catch steam, and there are people working on this. There are, for example, the text like Revelation, in which Jesus is worshipped. Revelation was notably controversial among Christians, and it was not accepted as canon by everyone everywhere. It is true that later Christians begin the regular worship of Jesus. He is thought of as pre-existing his human birth and so on. But again, the Quran is saying that the greater part of Christians corrupted the original revelation that Jesus left them. So even if you had like widespread worship of Jesus very early, that's not a contradiction of what the Quran is saying in the surah that you, or whatever, the verse that you quoted. So I think like the real meat is not being, or the real sensitive point is not being struck at, because he can grant you that the New Testament calls Jesus God, that there were Christians who worshiped Jesus very early on. The claim is not that all Christians were, pure from a Quranic point of view. Some of them were, a smaller portion of them were. The larger part of them corrupted things. So I don't see how this is inconsistent with what the Quranic verse was saying.
Yeah, the way it becomes inconsistent, because I find very difficult to see how the disciples of Jesus could have been said to been prevalent or victorious in any meaningful way if that's the scenario that took place.
do you think victorious means like politically victorious?
I mean,
That's not the story of the Quranic messengers. Like most Quranic messengers come and they're just like rejected. You never, apart from David and Solomon, you really don't hear about a Quranic messenger having all this political victory or this sort of thing. Like I just don't think that's part of the discourse. Now I think the point you did have is you do have an early proto-Sunni current of thinking, right? Umayyad, probably fueled by Umayyad propaganda that said the true religion of God and God's true caliph is going to like beat everybody. I think that current existed, but I think I don't see why I would have to then project this Umayyad political type thinking back into the Quranic notion of being above or higher or whatever the word is, especially when you consider that the verses I showed you indict the Christians, right? Like it directly criticized the Christians. It said they forgot the covenant. We have placed like a disunity among the Christians until the day of judgment. That doesn't sound like, the Quran is saying like the Catholic Church or whatever is victorious by God. It sounds like the Quran is saying the Christians have all these internal disputes among themselves and they don't really know what they're doing.
Yeah, I actually have trouble squaring Surah 355 with those other passages that you mentioned, because at least at face value it seems to
Yeah.
imply sort of contradiction. But
No,
you
because
said
one is about disciples, like
mm,
355 is about Jesus' immediate disciples. It's saying they prevailed. But let's go back to 355. Jesus' disciples prevailed against the actual enemies of Jesus,
mhm,
especially that we know that like the primary adversaries of Jesus, right, are a Jewish faction,
mhm.
right? The high priest. What was their name for that faction? Like, were they the Sadducees?
There were mixed groups. Some of them were Pharisees, some were
Yeah.
Sadducees.
Okay. So let's say it's like a Pharisee Sadducee faction. They control the temple. They oppose Jesus. They got him crucified, right?
Mm,
The Quran is saying they lost, and they did lose, right? They did
yeah.
lose because we know that the disciples. I mean, if we whatever historicity you give the Book of Acts, we know according to the disciples, the Jesus way, the Jesus movement was spreading. There were thousands of Pharisees I mean, there were Pharisees who believed in Jesus, right? Isn't that in the Book of
Mhm,
Acts? It
right.
seems like the Jesus movement was very successful in Jerusalem, right? And then the temple is destroyed, and that's the end of the faction that
Mm,
opposed Jesus. They don't even exist anymore. So like the disciples won over them,
mhm.
and then that type again, if the disciples were had the same beliefs as Ebionites, that belief system survived the destruction of Jerusalem, right? It didn't end in
So
70 AD, right? But it continues. You also know from your history books from Eusebius that the first, or did it freeze? The first
mm,
dozen, I think the first dozen bishops of the Jerusalem church were Torah observant. I think Eusebius refers to them as of the circumcision. Now,
right.
you need to ask if the first 12 or so bishops of the Jerusalem church, and the Jerusalem church is the mother church. Now, I know you don't think so. You think the Roman
Mhm,
church is, but I think most historians will say the Jerusalem church is the mother church. So like some people even call these people popes in a sense, like
mhm,
James, the brother of Jesus, as a pope. So anyway, why are they off the circumcision? Because in your small c Catholic Christianity, once you believe in Jesus, you shouldn't observe the law, even if you're Jewish. But these people who are the Jerusalem church, why are they zealous for the law? They clearly follow a somewhat of a different Christian
mm.
belief system than the one that you're talking about.
So, quick question: did God continue to aid the Hawariyun after AD 70?
Again, who are the Hawariyun are the disciples, right? So the
Mhm.
disciples will pass away, right? I mean, they don't live that long, do they?
Okay. I mean, presumably these Hawariyun themselves had followers. So, is
Yeah,
the
so there
reckoning
you
then
go.
that the aid was only for their immediate generation?
Well, it's like this. Using the Shia imams as an example. So I'm Ismaili. We follow the line of Prophet Muhammad's descendants. Now, for most
Mhm,
of their history, this lineage has been persecuted and they had some political success, but most of history they have not had political success.
mhm,
But they endured, like we would
mhm,
say, they endured from the perspective of truth, and they continue to be present and guiding their communities. The Ebionites endured. I mean, we know that,
mhm,
and that's why even some scholars believe that the Ebionites continue to exist into the eve of Islam, and Muhammad and the Quran are actually like reconstituting this Ebionite sort of
mhm.
Christology and like updating it.
Yeah, I, yeah. That argument seems a little problematic historically because we don't have evidence that the Ebionites persisted until the eve of Islam. So you'd have to posit that they were around, but they were just, I don't know, underground, and that
I mean,
nobody.
Patricia Crona and other scholars they actually use the Quran as evidence that
Mhm,
the Jewish Christians were around because there's so much kinship between Quranic view of Jesus as an Israelite prophet, Messiah, and those beliefs. But basically, like there are different ways to read those verses you cited, right? Because we have to combine the like, you have to take the verses I cited as well, which are saying within Christians there's a group that believed, has faith, and there's another group that innovated and they're corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
And the corrupt group still exists because the Quran talks about them in present in Surah 5. It says, like, those who say today, like, we are Christians, we've placed disunity among their hearts. So I don't know how would you reconcile those verses that like indict Christians with your understanding of the other verses?
I'll have to think about that a little bit
Yeah,
more.
no, that's no problem.
Yeah.
I mean,
Now, I do have a follow-up question that is related to the general trajectory we're going. So, as an Ismaili Shi'i, what is your view of the Apostle Paul? Like, would you accept the same narrative that the Sunnis would have, that he was a corrupter who introduced like foreign doctrines to
so
Christianity?
there's a good article on this. So Bilal Muhammad, who's a 12er Shi'i, he wrote an article on like the Berkeley, not University of Berkeley, but there's some sort of some research think tank called Berkeley, I think, and he wrote an article about the views of Paul in Sunni and Shi'i sources. So interestingly, some of the Sunnis they have some material that's positive on Paul, right? Like they call Paul a few of the early Sunnis, proto Sunnis, really have some good things to say about Paul. But interestingly, in 12 verse Shi'i sources, Paul is attacked, like he's called almost like a devil. There's narrations from attributed to the imams that say Paul like corrupted the religion of Jesus and this sort of thing. I haven't seen any, and that's 12 verse Shia sources. I haven't actually seen anything of Paul in Ismaili sources that I've read. I'm not saying it's not there. I just haven't read it yet. So the way I look at it is like, I think I see Paul the way some of the historians see Paul, like James Tabor and actually even James Dunn. So James Dunn actually says Paul broke with the Jerusalem church. I don't think Paul is like some intentionally evil guy. Okay, like I don't think Paul comes and says, you know what, I'm here to corrupt everything. Let's get on this. I don't have that view of Paul. I do think Paul has some distinct Christological views, which don't come from the historical Jesus and do not come from the apostles of the historical Jesus. But Paul believed that the risen Jesus had inspired him with some of these views. And I think he was well-meaning in what he was doing, like he was sincere. But I do think it marks there are some major differences in his theology and the theology of the historical Jesus. Mind you, I don't think Paul was a Trinitarian either. I think Paul has a high Christology and maybe a pre-existent Jesus, but I don't even think Paul is a Trinitarian. So I don't take the conspiracy view, right? That you may hear, like, oh yeah, Paul came along and he wants to corrupt. I don't think he wants to corrupt anything. I think that there's so much diversity in early Christianity, and there are probably Gnostics as well that they don't like, their voice is sort of blotted out, and there are probably all these other groups. There's like adoptionists. So I think it's natural, just like in early Islam, there are going to be different views of who Jesus is, and like what's the emphasis, his teachings or his death, his resurrection, this sort of thing.
Okay, it's interesting. I'll have to look into that article that you mentioned.
So we're a little over 2 hours and 15 minutes or so here. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I'd love to continue this conversation, however, in the future. So anytime y'all want to do it, let me know. The platform is completely open to you. I do want to give y'all just very quickly some, an opportunity for some closing words, maybe starting with you, Dr. Nemes.
I want to say I've really enjoyed participating in this conversation. I wonder sometimes, though, because I know so little about this subject, and I'm talking to people who know it much more than I do. I wonder whether some of the things that I said were just stupid or beside the point, or didn't really contribute much to the conversation. If that was the case, I apologize. I'm following it as a philosophical argument. I want to know if this is a critique that has some teeth. So where I thought I saw a dialectical weakness, I wanted to, I wanted to address it and to pounce on it. I will say, looking on the outside as an uninterested observer, I do think that one problem that is coming up again and again in this argument is the interpretation of Islamic sources and Quranic sources in terms that I don't think are necessary from the point of view of the Quran itself. You find this sort of thing historically happening in Christianity. You would have Irenaeus, for example, and Marcion or Valentinus or the Gnostics disagreeing about the interpretation of the Old Testament. The Gnostics or Marcion would read the Old Testament in a way to suggest that there's no way that the God of the Old Testament is the Father of Jesus Christ. And then Irenaeus responds by reading the Old Testament in a way as to reconcile the presentation of God there with the presentation of God in the New Testament Gospels. So, this sort of thing happens in Christianity where people will look at the same text and they'll read it in ways to sort of pull it in their direction or, away from the other person. I think like if this argument is really going to proceed, if it's really going to become something, then the sort of the Islam unfavorable or Christian favorable readings of the Quranic passages have to be much more strongly motivated than, for example, Sam did in the debate. I thought that in the debate, Sam's readings were not at all compelling. And I think there are all sorts of parallels from Christian theological history that we can appeal to in order to make sense of what's going on here, or in order to make sense of certain Quranic language. For example, the way that Christians will say that the story of Jesus helps to make sense of the Old Testament. And if you don't have Jesus, if you don't have the tale of Jesus in the Gospels, then the Old Testament is sort of theologically incoherent or, confusing or like the veil is there, to use the image that Paul gives. It seems to me like there's nothing stopping the Quranic author from talking the same way about the Quran in relation to the Christian ideas. That if you were to understand the Quranic revelation and then you were to think back on the sources that Christians have, then you would see that actually that's the teaching that's there. You would be able to fill in the blanks and see the way the puzzle pieces fit together. Now, whether or not that is actually true, of course, is another matter. And even people who hear Christians make arguments about how necessary Jesus is to make sense of the Old Testament, a lot of Jews will not be convinced by that because they're not all Christians, obviously. But I just, all this is to say that I see parallels in the Quranic passages and in some of the topics that are brought up in this discussion with things that happen in Christian theology, which of course is the sphere that is familiar to me. And it seems to me that a lot of the sorts of arguments that are made in defense of Christian ideas or within certain Christian traditions in defense of their ideas against those of others, you could make the same arguments here in the present case, defending the Quran against this claim of internal contradiction with respect to its attitudes about Christian beliefs. So my final word, I suppose, is I think that this argument, this Islamic dilemma argument, needs a lot of work if it's going to really be convincing. And from my point of view, it seems to me that Khalil can give very easily motivated, justifiable readings of the Quran to avoid the trouble.
Very helpful, especially from a philosophical perspective. I really appreciate your insight, and I'd love to have you back on the show anytime you want. Just let me know. We'll make it happen again. Lewis, go ahead and give your concluding thoughts here.
Yeah, so I basically did my best to steelman the Islamic dilemma as best I can and refute the objections that Khalil gave for it. Now, as I mentioned, I do hold to a version of it, but the version that I would deploy would be a little bit different from the version that often gets deployed in most popular polemics. So hopefully the version that I presented would hold up better in a debate.
Yeah, so I'm thankful for the opportunity to come here and discuss this with all of you. I really I requested Lewis specifically because Lewis is a smart guy, and he's very well read and well educated on like Islam and Christianity, right? I mean, you're a Christian, but you're doing your PhD in like Islamic studies, so I think you bring a unique perspective. And I asked Stephen to come because Stephen is a professional philosopher and a theologian, and I thought he could just give like a because like I'm Muslim and I have commitments, and Lewis has his commitments, and Stephen has different commitments, and sometimes someone with different commitments, because like presumably Stephen sort of believes in the Bible, right? So he has like one foot in there, but then he's not a Trinitarian. So I thought getting his voice here would be an interesting sort of thing. But generally, I appreciated the discussion. I appreciated the pushback that Lewis gives, because even if I don't agree with you, I have to carefully consider everything you say, and sort of think about it and go back and say, okay, review what are these arguments and this sort of thing. So I'm very thankful, Lewis, for doing what you did here. I do acknowledge that the Islamic dilemma, as stated, looks like a very Protestant argument, right? Like it's just directed toward like a scripture, and it sometimes presumes too much about scripture, because these texts don't interpret themselves. The New Testament doesn't interpret itself, and this sort of thing. But overall, what I was trying to do in the debate is, I notice most Muslims who discuss this with Sam Shamoon, like they're just like callers on a call-in show, and they don't have much preparation, and Sam doesn't really let them talk and this sort of thing. So I did the debate because I thought, this is a great opportunity to talk uninterrupted and like get a presentation out there, for people to think about. What I like specifically about this channel, though, is that you guys have your beliefs, and you're proud of your beliefs, but I find you guys you're not that polemical, and it makes it easier to converse with you guys, right? Like when you invite me, you're not trying to get me in like a clippable like gotcha moment or something, right? Like you have genuine desire to hear and think. And I think that says a lot about today's Catholic tradition. A lot of the people I know involved in interfaith work and writing interfaith books are Catholics, and they're inspired by some of the papal documents on interfaith, and you can see that sort of reflected in the way you and Michael conduct yourself. So I'm very thankful that you guys are doing engagements, and that you have me as a guest.
Yeah, always a pleasure. And I will say this about the whole head-butting polemical thing. I did get into a little bit of that in my younger years. The main reason I don't do that anymore is because it's extremely stressful. Like I really don't see how people can do that with any length of time without suffering some kind of mental breakdown. So it's just a lot better for my mental health to do things this way.
No, I agree. And the thing is, I want to tell you this, and I've told Stephen this, and maybe you guys will talk about this one day. I do think, even though I don't agree with your conclusion, but I think, Lewis, your presentation on the deity of Christ, according to the New Testament, is probably one of the strongest I've seen, like in the modern times, like on YouTube. I know you've done it here and maybe other channels. I think you make a very good case for that reading, and I've told others. I think I've told Stephen. I think one day, you and Lewis should talk about this, and Stephen can speak for himself. But like he's not much into the debates, but he's into sort of these exchanges, and I think that would be an interesting exchange. And I've noticed, Lewis, that like you've changed the way that you come across when you do these things. So you had a great discussion with Sam Tideman, recently, and I think that's like a textbook way to do this. Like you didn't agree with him, and like you questioned him, but you weren't trying to sort of like beat him over the head like with an argument or a rebuttal or this sort of thing. So I would just say, keep going. Like you guys are, you and Stephen, like you guys know how to do these discourses, and just keep going, and keep inviting me, because I have fun too.
We'll certainly have you back on, all of you. Thank y'all so much for coming on, and everybody, thank y'all for watching. Hit that subscribe button and the like button. We'll see you next time.